Hello, welcome to another virtual program from Maine Historical Society. I'm Kathleen Newman. It's March 22nd, 2022, and this is Unpacking the Past, Fashions from the Maine Historical Society Collection with Jacqueline Field. Jacqueline Field is a textile and dress historian. She was formerly costume curator at Westbrook College in Portland, where she taught textile and dress history. She researches silk production and consumption with a focus on the relationship between 19th and early 20th century Asian sericulture and the United States silk industry. Jackie is the author of Textiles and Designs, Bates Mill 1930 to 1990, and lead author of American Silk 1830 to 1930, Entrepreneurs and Artifacts. Her articles include North American Silk Industry and Dress, and Agriculture to Industry, Silk Production and Manufacture in Maine, 1800 to 1930. And she joins us this evening as part of our series for our exhibition, Northern Threads, 200 Years of Clothing at Maine Historical Society. And this is also a part of our series on celebrating 200 years of MHS. Jackie, thanks so much for being here with us.
Well, it's a pleasure. I look forward to this evening and some questions at the end.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, in the early 19th century, Maine was new to statehood. It was a place being drawn into change, a place with an increasingly more loose-knit, mobile society where dress played a significant role as middling and upper middle class people jostled their way up the economic, social, and political ladder. Clothing was used to help construct self-image, to create a new persona to live up to and use to advantage. Maine Historical Society's collection of European-style clothes worn by Maine inhabitants during the past more than 200 years consists of about 3,000 garments, uniforms, and accessories. Today, the primary focus is on dresses. Different clothing categories may be viewed in the Society's themed galleries online. Needless to say, the current Northern Threads exhibition could not include all the examples that might have been wished. Choices are not easy. This presentation supplements the current Northern Threads investigation of fashion and the fashionable in Maine's first 100 years. It offers an opportunity to view and discuss some of the collection's garments that are not included in the exhibition, may not have been seen previously, or for one reason or another can't be exhibited. The intention is to give the collection wider exposure. With few exceptions, the garments shown are all from the Society's collection. Any exception is so labeled. Well, the first, or the earliest examples are from the 18th century, the era of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, and the Enlightenment. During that time, clothing underwent its own revolution. Now, in a nutshell, as Project Runway might put it, by 1800, cumbersome brocade silk gowns such as that on the left here were out, and the simple high-waist chemise style dress was in. Even more revolutionary, cotton replaced silk as fashion's favorite fabric. The original owner of this 18th century silk brocade gown, one of the oldest garments in the collection, was Mary Murdoch, who immigrated to Philadelphia in 1735. Whatever its original date, her dress was altered around 1775. Since then, the center bodice or stomacher was lost. Her third-generation granddaughter, Maine resident Julia St. Felix, donated the gown to Maine Historical Society. To the right, a white tambour-embroidered Indian muslin chemise dress. The inset sleeves and place it about 1805, but surviving records claim it was worn by young Lucia Longfellow to the Portland Assembly Ball in 1799. With its high waist, drawstring neckline, straight sleeves, back gathers, and long train, it likely made quite a stir and certainly placed her among the city's fashion-informed and economically better off. Such dresses were often worn with long sleeves and sometimes a narrow pale-colored ribbon sash below the bust. Now, how did Lucia dance with such a long train? Jane Austen provides an answer. In her early 1800s novel, Northanger Abbey, she tells us how, quote, Catherine Morland and Isabella Thorpe pinned up each other's trains for the dance. Said to have been intended for a wedding dress, this simple woven striped dress on the left was made somewhere between 1805 and 1810 for Delphine Paris of Buckfield. The bodice has moved on from the simple drawstring style. The neckline is shaped and square, and the sleeves have taken on a rounded puff. To the right, a chemise ball gown from about 1810, made of delicate Indian cotton mull. Its features puff sleeves with embroidered frills, and the scallop edge skirt is embellished with a deep band of white hand embroidery. It's a remarkable survivor and the finest of the collection's early 1800s white gowns. In the early 1800s, trade in desirable, fashionable, delicate Indian cottons was largely controlled by the British East India Company. Fine white cottons used in American dresses were a luxury, most likely imported from England. They filtered into Maine communities via Boston and various Maine ports, not least Eastport, a prosperous, growing smuggling and commercial center on what is now Maine's northern border. With access to imported textiles and fancy goods and constant contact with traders and travelers, Eastport's merchants were very well positioned to offer Maine customers a range of goods and fashion news. Reportedly, word of the latest French fashions crossed the Atlantic within 4 weeks. The slim 1820s silk crepe dresses seen here are thought to be part of Harriet Lampett Levy of Eastport's 1824 trousseau. Made of fabrics and trimmings available in Eastport, they have a high waist and inset waistbands and simple sleeve top puffs. Decorative braid trims the shoulder flanges on the diamond pattern green dress, which may be made of the kind of fabric that Olive King of Bath described when she wrote to her sister Carleen in Saco that, quote, gowns are made of figured canton crepes. They have puffs on the sleeve tops. Now, from its start, this straight high waist fashion lasted for about 25 years. Adopted by women of all shapes and sizes, the question might well be asked, what was worn under the high waist, slim tubular dresses? Not surprisingly, women wore the long, straight corsets that emerged to help streamline obstinately lumpy figures. On the left, a sketch of satirist James Gilway's caricature of an 1810 stiff busk front corset. Of course, there were also bust enhancers and bodices designed to corral and keep the bust in place. Corset shapes transitioned in step with fashion. On the right, a view of a rare surviving combination bust enhancer and corset from the late 1820s. It features the beginnings of waist shaping, soon to become more pronounced as waists return to their natural position. Corsets of one kind or another went on to shape women for the next more than 100 years. The population of Eastport, the entry point for so many fashion accoutrements, was about 4,000. Years earlier, in 1827, when the population stood at about 2,000, an advertisement announced a tailor and ladies' habit maker who could make, quote, correct fashions from Europe and the principal cities of America, thus communicating skill as a pattern maker. He also offered the helpful service of cutting and basting garments, a boon for home sewers and average dressmakers whose pattern making skills were generally limited. Said to have been made in New York by a French modiste, that's a cut above the average dressmaker, Portland's Zilpah Wadsworth's once pink, well-cut and sophisticated silk gown featured piped seams and a bow embellishing the back belt above deep flaring pleats. A wavy band of applique forms a fashionable hemline trimming. Sleeves are a little full at the top, tapering to the wrist. forming an early leg of mutton or gigot sleeve. They're topped with complex pierced puffs, superior to the simple puffs on Harriet Leavitt's home-stitched crepe dresses. The Ackerman fashion print illustrates a distinct leg of mutton or gigot sleeve with fashionable or romantic Van Dyke pointed details at the top, sleeve top, and Van Dyke points at the cuff. Daughters from Maine families who could afford to send them away to school learned embroidery, drawing, music, and social niceties, and additionally became familiar with fashion magazines such as Ackerman's Repository, the Gallery of Fashion with Heidelhoff's drawings, the Ladies' Monthly Museum, and others. By 1830, Godey's Ladies, and then by the 40s, Peterson's Magazine. This marvelous 1830s full-sleeve gigot purple ensemble is included in the Northern Threads exhibition. The imported silk's purple color was probably the product of a combination of logwood or Brazil wood and madder. Another of Harriet Lampett Leavitt's outfits, this confirms that fashion certainly flourished even in Maine's most northerly quarters. Possibly it's the work of the skilled Eastport tailor who, in addition to menswear, advertised as a lady's habit maker. Notice the refined details, the fine piped edgings on the collar and the cape-like pelerine, and the points edging the pelerine tails seen below the belt. The waist is about at natural level. The print at the left illustrates a fashionable accessory, a lace pelerine edged with Van Dyke points. Women could make their own lace or embroidered pelerines, or find one ready-made in Eastport, which by 1833 was the second largest trading port after New York, stocking goods from both New York and abroad, including crepes, Chinese silks, shawls, French yard goods, trimmings, and velvets. Made of heavy imported brown silk satin, this 1830s dress is also included in the Northern Threads exhibition. It's associated with the Maine St. Felix family who donated the 1775 gown. Derived from the mineral manganese, the color was known as manganese brown and was very fashionable at this date. Brown in all shades from light to dark are frequently found in period printed cottons and seen in the exhibition's brown striped cotton dress. The Royal Ladies Magazine fashion print shown on the right is a fashionable dress exactly the same, with the same 1830s upper arm gigot sleeve and the same diagonal bodice pleating. Notice the neck frill accessory, romantically known as a Betsy ruff, so called after Elizabethan era neckwear. Inside the beribboned wide-brimmed bonnet, fashionable bunches of curls nestle round the face. This is the era of artificial curls attached to combs for easy incorporation into the period's elaborate hairstyles. Let's skip to the 1840s and look at some early crinolines. The 1840s prevailing ideal of the demure, very feminine woman is communicated by fashion seen in this illustration. Restricted dress with tight bodices, pointed waists, and dome-shaped crinoline skirts, supported by stiff buckram and horsehair petticoats that hobbled movement and hindered strenuous activity. Additionally, face-shielding bonnets, long sleeves with mancheron undersleeves, high necklines modestly covered by tuckers further encouraged a demure demeanor. With the addition of the latter elements, neckline tuckers and long sleeves and mancherons, the 240s crinoline evening dresses here would become demure day gowns. The 1840s white crinoline's large skirt circumference is compressed down to waist size by tight, close cartridge pleating. With adequate support, this skirt would take on a dome shape. The pointed, attenuated bodice is shaped by long darts, boning, and wadding that suppresses the anatomy underneath. No neck tucker or insert or detachable sleeves survive for this dress. In the later 1840s pink and green plaid dress, pleats and center-back gathers fit this extremely wide skirt to waist dimensions. An underbodice attached to the heavily lined skirt fits over the shoulders to help support the weight. The bodice is pulled into shape by back lacing. This is the only back lace dress in the collection. Surviving detached sleeves are shown at the lower right. Just a quick glance at some typical mid-century hand-quilted cotton petticoats. One can imagine these lurking under average and not quite so full crinoline skirts. Now, a word about sewing thread. By the late 1840s, the silkworm craze and its hopes of fortune making, as rampant in Maine as everywhere else, had tailed away. Entrepreneurs now focused on inventing machinery to make usable silk threads. Hand sewing thread was a crucial commodity. The silk thread used for embroidery and preferred for dressmaking was an imported luxury. The best and most expensive was Italian. Chinese was less costly. There were no reels or balls of sewing thread. It was packaged in little skeins that women handled carefully to avoid waste from tangles. Uniforms and male garments are well represented in the exhibition. Minor articles of masculine dress were the subject of attention from those bastions of female interest, Bodice and Peterson's magazines. Seasonally, they suggested items calling for thread of one sort or another to stitch, knit, crochet, or embroider, gifts appropriate for male relatives or friends. Instructions ranged over objects such as those pictured here, which are not from the main collection: smoking caps, slippers, suspenders, and shaving kit covers. Inset top left from Peterson's December 1858, instructions for a crochet smoking cap described as a suitable Christmas gift, or New Year gift rather, for a gentleman friend. During the 1850s, the American and later, the American silk industry remained in the development stage. Fashion still relied on imported silk yard goods. It would be remiss, however, not to point out that imports also included very attractive, lightweight woolens and silk mixed fabrics. On the left, a heavy imported woven blue-gray silk stripe is trimmed with expensive silk fringe braid and fancy buttons. On the right, a light taffeta imported sheeny or printed warp silk. Warp slippage during weaving creates the characteristic blurry-edged effect. There is a sheeny dress in the exhibition. Now, at mid-century, cloth-making and fashion steadily benefited from technical innovations large and small. Briefly among them, the 1841 improvement of the lever's lace machine. In the 1840s, dressmaking patterns began to become available. In 1851, Northampton's Corticelli Silk Company developed a sewing thread that did not break in a machine, solving the problem that had been holding up sewing machine stitching. In Massachusetts, wire manufacturer Ichabod Washburn produced a hard steel wire to make sewing machine needles. And in the mid-1850s, his flexible industrial steel wire was adopted for crinoline hoops and bustle supports. Civil War uniforms were machine stitched, and in the late 1860s, sewing machines began to reach professional dressmakers and home sewers everywhere. By the 1870s, numerous mills, including Maine's Haskell Silk Company, manufactured a variety of types of thread for use by pioneering manufacturers, by now able to make narrow goods such as fringes, cords, ribbons, and trimmings that we find embellishing late 19th century fashionable dress. This selection is from the collection. At the 1875 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia, Americans accustomed to everything silk being an import were surprised to find examples of American-made fancy silk trimmings and even small silk handkerchiefs. Mary Read Goodeno's late 1850s brown and green jacquard pattern silk crinoline skirt would have been held out by one of the wire hoop petticoats introduced about 1856. Perhaps Peterson's magazine button trimming idea inspired the button arrangement on Mrs. Goodeno's bodice front and back. The drawing also illustrates a bishop's sleeve, a full sleeve gathered into a cuff, and one of several fashionable at this time. During what was apparently a very hot August in 1869, Godey's Ladies Book wrote, quote, "Our only desire is for cool and thin articles of attire. Dresses of organdy and grenadine." Grenadine was another lightweight fabric. "White is the favorite with both young ladies and those more advanced." This pair of white organdy dresses from the collection give an idea of what was being talked about. Left, a late 50s circular hoop-supported organdy summer dress with bishop sleeves, possibly worn by Nellie Spiller of Portland. On the right, a white organdy ball gown with frilled border scallops illustrates the 60s transition from circular to back thrust skirts. The old circular wire crinoline supports were supplanted by a crop of new, appropriately shaped cages and devices suitable for flat-fronted, full-backed skirts. Made of the lightest thin cotton organdy, these dresses are miracles of survival, and so unfortunately their fragility makes it prohibitive to consider exhibition. Important to the collection, two late 1860s walking dresses, masterpieces of dressmaking with flat fronts and full-back trailing skirts. They illustrate the increasing use of readily available American-made trimmings, now speedily stitched on by a sewing machine. The two-piece blue gown from Mrs. Bradford of Yarmouth is festooned with white piping, narrow black lace, bands of fringe, and fancy ribbon bows. Worn by Sarah Hart, elder of Portland, the three-piece gray outfit with a detachable back overskirt features wide bands of cream ribbon and black lace along every edge. Oops. Old and worn out, this pair of dresses are also important, but for different reasons. In this case, because so few survive to help construct the unwritten story of the times and lives as lived by a different sector of society. Dresses seen here fall into a category referred to as interior or house dresses. They are what they appear to be, very ordinary, everyday, or work dresses, not worn or seen outside the family hearth and home. Both have the coat sleeve of mid-century period. Made with the new long continuous panels and no waist seam, the homemade brown cotton check button through is awkwardly constructed, but the placement of the contrasting trimming, somewhat discolored and stained, appears carefully planned. The tattered blue silk with its tears and its repairs is well worn and clearly started life in better circumstances. Perhaps it was a hand-me-down or belonged to someone who fell on hard times. Around 1870, the term tea gown emerged in reference to a new type of upper-class indoor or informal gown. Rooted in establishment fashion and covered in the fashion press, tea gowns were often princess line, meaning no waist seam, worn with or without corsets, but not tight-fitting. At this time, they often featured drapery and lace and ribbon trimmings. By century's end, tea gowns were worn when entertaining one or two select female friends for a dainty afternoon tea. The tea gown's social and cultural significance is a subject of scholarly discourse. A fabulous gem of the collection, this tea gown is associated with Sarah Maria Lowell Morse of Portland. Sarah and her husband, Arthur Drinkwater Morse, socialized in Portland's musical circles. They entertained frequently in their Pearl Street apartment, but this gown would not have been worn in mixed company or have been seen outside the home. Insufficient dress allowances doled out by husbands often made keeping up with constantly changing fashion difficult. Middle-class women sewed for themselves or employed dressmakers to alter and update existing garments. Over time, some garments survived to end up in fashion collections. Others were altered, adapted, or repurposed, as happened to an 1840s teal blue figured silk crinoline. Its full skirt long gone, all that remains are two sleeves and one side of its bodice, with the other side stripped down, revealing the underbody. But the skirt is not lost. It's there in front of us, made into a fashionable 1880s basque or jacket with accents of solid teal blue. Apparently, a practical home seamstress made use of the old crinoline skirt to eke out her clothing budget. No matching 1880s skirt survives, but it seems obvious the dressmaker made the jacket to go with the skirt. It's not difficult to imagine that, aware of the vogue for pattern and plain seen in the brown bustle dress at the side, this clever seamstress made a bustle skirt of the solid teal accent fabric with a panel of figured silk on the front. This adaptive reuse sample is in the exhibition, but the skirt, of course, remains in the imagination. By the 1890s, the American silk fabric industry was in full production. Libby's department store and Eastman's specialty silk store in Portland, Peck's huge department store in Lewiston, Freeze's in Bangor, all stocked shelf loads of bolts of domestically manufactured affordable silk of every kind in every color and pattern. American silk was very affordable, but not cheap. Of the two garments here with faux bolero and the mid-1890s revived jigo sleeve, the dressy black and red outfit is likely home sewn of American-made silk. The sturdy brown wool dress is an example of a practical, modest, mid-1890s everyday wear. Right, the double gigot sleeve wine and cream dress is made of superb European silks. Closely resembling gowns by French couturier Worth, this creation was made in Lewiston, Maine in 1896 for Mrs. Mary King Scrimger. She and her husband, the engineer responsible for the electrification of the huge mill complex in Lewiston, found life there in Lewiston sophisticated enough to warrant her dressing so extremely fashionably. In Northern Threads Part 2, coming this fall, there will be an opportunity to inspect this and other items from her fabulous turn-of-the-century wardrobe. Just as fashionable and extravagant as Mrs. Scrimger's end of the 1890s gown, details from two luxurious evening or theatre coats embellished with heavy corded and tasseled trimmings known as passementerie. At century's end, with affordable silk so available and abundant, light silks, satins, and lace gradually displaced bulky Victorian cotton underwear, at least for the better off. Corsets were covered with colorful satins, drawers, combinations, chemises, petticoats, bedroom wear, and the like became lacy, frilly, and decorative, made of silks, satins, and crepes in pastel pinks and peachy colors, and even black trimmed with ribbon and cream or black lace. This turn-of-the-century silk chiffon peignoir, fragile, frilled, and silk flower trimmed, is an example of the bedroom dressing gown transformed. As is obvious, such a fragile garment would be very difficult to display in an exhibition. That this peignoir is in the collection tells us at least one Mainer enjoyed truly luxurious lingerie. From the puff gigot sleeve of the 1890s, the early 20th century takes us to the puff pouch bodice of the S-bend fashion. The silhouette with its beautifully fluid silk drapery reminds us that this was the era of sinuous Art Nouveau. and that the severely corseted S-band fashion was the last corset-controlled silhouette. The Society's collection includes a number of S-style gowns. Due to the custom of using inexpensive weighted silk for the linings, common everywhere, not just in Maine, and the linings having long since shredded away, museums often find S-style dresses impossible to display. In good condition, the Maine Historical Society collection of printed silk early 1900s S-band gowns includes this blue associated with Annie Moriarty of Moriarty's Corset Shop, Lewiston, Maine. The aquamarine with a noticeably generous amount of fabric in the skirt belonged to Mrs. Scrimgeour, also of Maine, of Lewiston, and the brown was from Mrs. P. Thomas of Portland. Oops. Dressed in their up-to-date pouched bodice blouses of simpler fabrics, but no S corsets, this group of relaxed mill workers was captured in the Haskell Silk Mill, Westbrook, by a keen photographer and production manager, Ernest Gerhardt. It was thanks to his textiles and expertise that the Haskell Company became famous for silk that did not flake or split. Around 1910, and 100 years since its introduction, the high-waist slim tubular style returned. The revived slim style did not banish corsets, but led the way to modern dress. On the left, purchased in Boston by a Maine resident, a tubular black velveteen dinner gown with a complex silk and metallic embroidered yoke. On the right, a high-waist black lace dinner gown worn by Bema Sturtevant Stewart and made by a relative, Justina W. Thomas. In the center, a purple wool challis dress, up to the minute in style, with a high waist and overskirt. This dress is believed to be the work of Martha Riley of Cherryfield in northern Maine. A masterpiece of superb detailed dressmaking, it's regarded as one of the highlights of the collection. Now, fashion shows often end with a wedding dress, and so, stepping back to 1894, two views of the utterly delightful beribboned and gigot-sleeved wedding dress worn by Myra Burdine Philpott for her April 25th marriage to Melville Philpott of Limerick, Maine, whose own wedding outfit is also seen here. It's rare to have the bride and the groom's outfits. The Philpott wedding clothes are especially treasured items in the Society's collection. Now, a last word. Notice and enjoy the dress's silk ribbons. At one time, store ribbon departments were major revenue earners. A bad ribbon year ruined the bottom line. Ribbon was used for hair bows, sashes, updating hats, and a myriad of ephemeral fashion touches such as you see here that rarely survive. Ribbons are the ghosts in the costume collection. So thank you for attending this presentation. Now we can move ahead, Kathleen.
Thank you so much, Jackie. That was wonderful. We're getting a lot of great questions from the audience. Hope we'll have time to get to them all. I'm going to try and maybe put some similar ones together.
Yes.
But let's start with this one because it's a question I've already gotten in our gallery. How did women sit down with a bustle?
Well, you just sort of puffed it up. The contraptions that were worn underneath often were springy and they kind of concertinated down, but they obviously, you didn't slouch. I mean, people,
right, I think there was a different expectation of how we'd sit in a chair today versus back then.
Yes, and you would only wear your biggest, best bustle if you were out visiting or some sort of situation like that. But certainly you could sit down.
Sure.
If you've been watching recent, the Golden Age program on television with excessive bustles, that was at the extreme. There were only a small number of people dressed like that.
Sure. A lot of people are asking about keeping this clothing clean. walking like on dirty and muddy streets. And then I think even just in a more general sense, laundering a lot of this clothing. Can you talk any about those techniques?
Well, first of all, the inside of many of these long skirts had reinforced hems and sometimes a band of lining underneath, which, you know, have been described by the satirists as sort of street sweepers, you know. And so it was a problem keeping them dry and clean. And I don't think the average woman wore extreme fashions. You have to bear that in mind. As far as, you know, cleaning, sometimes if the fabric was sturdy, it could be clean, sponged down. There were various recipes and help given in the women's magazines. Sometimes they would be unpicked, the fabric would be turned, you know, to freshen it up. And then the other thing, of course, people, as far as bodily fluids were concerned and stains, there was all of that cotton underwear that was worn that came between the body and the outer garment. So it wasn't an easy thing, and people probably didn't smell as fresh as we do today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's another change in expectation that
exactly.
Before the laundry machine, you know, the washing machine and modern detergents come around, the expectation or what was considered like a clean garment and acceptable to out, very different from perhaps the standard we have in the 21st century.
It's true, exactly.
Folks are also asking about fashions from working class individuals, people that lived on farms. I know you showed us a couple, what you called
the working
presentation.
Dress, yes.
Mm-hmm. But can you talk a little bit about, are there more of those in MHS's collection, and maybe why we don't see quite as many of them?
Okay, well, there are items, there are not many in any collection for the simple reason they were worn out. Dresses, for instance, were made of sturdier materials. On farms, for instance, they'd be worn plainer materials, and even the better so-called materials, they would be cut down for daughters' dresses, for children's dresses. No fabric would be wasted. But the reason why there aren't many of these garments is simply that they were worn out. The fabric was used up. You know, they would end up possibly as just floor cloths at the very, very end, but nothing was wasted. I think you also have to remember that people tended only to own a very few. Mm-hmm. The ordinary person only owned a few garments, not crammed wardrobes as we're used to today.
Sure. And so what you have to remember when you're looking at what you see when you visit Northern Threads or really any similar collection,
it's something of a middle and upper middle class.
Right. There's something of a collection bias in terms of just what was available. I think we're certainly, you tend to see more of a privileged perspective, again, just because of what survived. And that also speaks to, someone's asking about the sizes of the dress. Do all of the dresses in our collections have tiny waists? Are there some larger waist ones? One of the reasons we see so many tiny waists is because if a dress doesn't fit very many people, it's not getting passed around and subsequently out.
Oh, well, also often there for the younger women. Mm-hmm. A lot of young teenagers today are still slim. They haven't begun to spread out. People, I think physically, some people were smaller then anyway, but there's always that myth about tiny 18-inch waists and all the rest of it. But I think this is the element of what survives are things that maybe were outgrown or just simply weren't worn as much, or for one reason or other. And once they're also in collections, something that perhaps it's always very difficult to exhibit. There's signs of alterations on the inside where things have been let out. And clearly the waist that many women had when they were 20 broadened out with numerous pregnancies. And there are also other kinds of house dresses that served during those situations. But certainly there are dresses with a larger waist, but it's in the nature of the beast, so to speak, that the ones with the narrower waist tend to be the ones that survive.
Right. we're asking a bit about, a lot of people are asking about how these are made. So are we looking at things that a lot of people made on their own at home, or these that were, you know, made by the skills of a dressmaker? Was being a dressmaker something that you could make a considerable living at? Can you talk about that a little bit?
There were a lot of dressmakers. It was a career, and there were different levels of dressmaking, you know. And if you look in a street directory, you know, all from the 19th century and other periods, and even into the 20th and well into the 20th, you would see a lot of dressmakers listed. And women would do a lot of basic sewing on themselves, and they would also maybe have, you could have maybe a best dress made by, or a more stylish best dress made by a dressmaker, but make plainer things for yourself or your children. And as I mentioned, I think a modiste, I think it was one of the Wadsworths had a dress made by someone who was noted as a modiste, which was somebody a little cut above the ordinary dressmaker. Just like now a tailor would be noted because tailors knew about making patterns. It's very, to make a pattern was not an easy thing. And when I referred to the fact that patterns became available in the 40s and mid-century, don't think about a nice packet with a picture on the front, such as you purchase today. It would be on a very small print in the small magazine page. There would be outlines all overlapping each other. So a person who wanted to make a pattern had to decipher which all the pattern pieces and somehow translate them into a larger size. So it was no mean feat to make a pattern for a fashionable bodice or a sleeve. It was quite a challenge. But clearly some women managed to do it a little bit better than others. But there were levels of dressmaking. One might also, dressmakers themselves employed different helpers. For instance, there would be girls or women employed to sew the long seams. There would be others who were more skilled who would do finer work or buttonholes and so on and so forth. So it was a big business making clothes until the garment making industry got off. It was underwear at first that was the big, you know, mass produced product. But the garment industry took time to develop. And there was also a certain element for an upper class and even middle class, a certain snobbery about buying ready to wear. You know, there was still a certain elitism about having your clothes made by a dressmaker.
So related question, when did the sewing machine become common in people's homes?
Well, by the late 1860s, it was filtering out, but they were expensive. You could maybe compare it to the use of computers. Remember how when computers first came out, a few people would have them, but now they're just everywhere. But with sewing machines, there were a few people would have them. They were expensive, and sometimes in small communities, half a dozen women would club together to buy one and share it. Because if you think about sewing long seams, and remember, not just clothes, you couldn't run down to Sears or somewhere and buy sheets and things like that. You know, household goods that needed to be sewn, children's goods. So by the 1860s, they were really percolating out into the wider population. And you could easily say by the end, well, say the 70s, 80s, they were fairly widespread.
What kind of fabric would be typical in like the smaller, more rural areas?
Well, obviously plainer fabrics there. There is, talking of, you know, worn, you know, you spoke earlier about well-worn or tattered or older clothing. There is a wonderful one example in this collection here of a country cloak of heavy woolen fabric that was found in the barn, I think, of a farm somewhere in a town south of Portland. And it's this very strong, heavy wool that's been very, very well worn, and it's got a lining that's coming away. And so in a way, that is a treasure as much as a couturier dress would be a treasure, because each is rare in its own place, you know. And so again, once girls went to work in the mills, for instance, coming from the countryside to work in mills and becoming wage earners. What did they spend their money on? Clothes, just like today. And often totally unsuitable clothes. But if they were working in mills and towns, that's what they did. In fact, there are studies made around 1900 of mill girls wasting their money. So the observer thought on cheap lace and cheap silk. There were some very cheap silks, and these girls would buy these clothes. They wanted to look good. It wasn't so very different from teenagers today.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell us about silk farms in Maine?
Yes. There were quite a few of them dotted around. Now, to say a farm, what do people visualize when they think about growing silk? Silkworms have to be fed mulberry leaves. They won't eat anything else. And when the silk craze, let's just backtrack for a minute. The reason for the silk craze was that America, after the War of Independence, was importing so much silk, and it was so expensive. There was a trade imbalance, because remember, after the revolution, there was no industry, there was nothing to export, nothing else that America to earn a revenue. And so the government decided to start, America should have its own silk industry, from silkworm to finished product. And they issued booklets on how to raise silkworms. And everybody was doing it up and down the East Coast and into the hinterland. And so, sounds so easy. Get some silkworm eggs, hatch the silkworms, feed them leaves, then they'll make their little cocoons and then just unwind them, and Bob's your uncle, and we'll make lots of money. But as it turns out, like everything, not so simple. What happens if you have all these silkworms hatched out and you don't have enough leaves? Or if the leaves don't come out in time? Little baby worms won't eat the big full leaves. They need to have special leaves. And what happens if all the rice and the mice and the rats get into your attic and eat up all your cocoons? It was not easy. So lots of people tried. And it just, let's say, it's a long story. I've written lots about it and I can recommend some reading, but it faded away. It sounds so easy, but it wasn't. Like everything, there was a skill. Remember, the Chinese had been at it for 5,000 years. They had got it down to a fine art. But silk was the desirable. And until there was synthetics, it was the only sort of special fabric.
Well, and related to that question, someone's asking, does cotton kind of replace silk because of the cost?
No, it was a fashionable thing. It was, at the time, it was fashionable. And it was a sort of, it was a total revolution in thinking at that time.
Sure. A couple people have asked about how are these pieces preserved and displayed? What goes into that?
Yes. Well, of course, that's become a whole science in itself, conservation. And so the Maine Historical has just gone through a large process of improving storage. So items are usually carefully, cleaned as far as if they need it. They are packed in acid-free tissue paper, and they are stored in boxes which are also acid-free. So there won't be regular cardboard. If you lay your clothes in boxes like that, they will become discolored from acid that's given off by the cardboard. So there's special cardboard boxes made for this purpose. And it's worth giving thought. Often people pick things off shelves that have been stored, where the material's been stored for a period of time, and find it's brown all around the edges. And that's because of the acid coming out of the wood and so on and so forth. And putting things in plastic bags is not a good idea, because it becomes a sort of microclimate, and you can develop moisture, and also it's a breeding ground for insects often too. So plastic is not a good material to store textiles.
And I know when we were preparing this exhibit, the mannequin forms. I think were all specially made.
That's right.
For each piece that's on display. We need to monitor the light levels in the gallery.
That's true.
And low. Yes. So they're a very special and delicate collection.
Yeah. Well, well, fabrics are subject to light and bad conditions. And for instance, as you know, pictures shouldn't be held. Anything like this shouldn't be hung near a window. The sunlight will fade something. And so, as I say, this whole consciousness of the things that cause fabric to deteriorate is something that's evolved over really the last, 25, 30 years. It's a new science. And so that it's a whole industry and business in itself, and something one can study as a subject in itself.
Well, thank you again, Jackie. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise. We're reaching the end of our time together. I know we didn't get to every single question. So those of you out there that still have burning questions about this collection or historic clothing, I've shared my email in the chat. It's KNEUMANN@mainehistory.org. You can reach me at that email. I'm happy to pass questions on to Jackie or on to our curatorial and collection staff here, and to point you in the right direction. Don't forget, if you're interested in seeing this exhibit in person, visit mainehistory.org, where you can learn more about our hours, our pandemic protocols that are in place and that are always changing. And you can even buy tickets in advance online. So I hope that we'll see everybody here in person soon. The first phase of this exhibit goes through, I think, the end of July. And then at the beginning of August, we're going to change over. So right now, when you come, you see about 1780 to 1889. And if you come between August and the end of December, you'll see 1890 to about 1980. Is there anything else that you wanted to say before we finish up, Jackie?
Well, just perhaps if people are particularly interested in the silk in Maine, when they, excuse me, email you, I can recommend an article which is in Maine History about exactly on that topic.
Fantastic. Well, thank you everybody so much for being here. Thank you again, Jackie, for this program. And I hope we'll see everybody back here real soon.